Hi everyone, welcome. We're preparing to check in on my African nightcrawler systems that live here in these two yellow buckets. The last feeding included lots and lots of bedding, and it was dry, meant to absorb moisture. So I'm curious to see how that worked out. It does seem like the worms really appreciated it, because there's a huge cavity diving down into both systems. So over here, bucket number 1, that's where we're going to begin with checking out how they're doing and getting them fed. The last feeding was pumpkin, and today it's going to consist of apples and pears and maybe some potato peels in here. And I know there's a bunch of bananas too, perhaps 2 banana peels or more per system. So nice, fruity, delicious meal. Now there is a significant difference between these two systems, and it's not their age because they're both the same age, 158 days old at this point. Not even the estimated worm count, because the estimated worm count in these is even pretty close. Over here in bucket number 1, 3,102, and over in bucket number 2, it's 3,055. So not much of a difference. 50. We estimated pretty close on both systems. So the feeding does not include any coffee or a replacement coffee filter to serve as our feeding zone indicator. So the one I just removed, I guess, can go back in to continue serving that purpose. Although in the past, I don't think I've really used feeding zone indicators in my buckets too much, because there's just so little space. You always kind of have to feed down the middle in a way, unless you're trying to accomplish something. So what I have here on my bench next to me is my prepared bedding, which is pretty well dampened. A little different from what I threw in here last time, which was stuff that was put in here completely dry. As I mentioned earlier, and as you were able to see from the recess in the plastic and the whole material, was that the feeding went down the middle. We've started out on the edges, because one thing I feel like I've not done much, if any of, in these systems was go to the edges, or maybe we did a few check-ins ago, but with the feedings always going down in the middle, it does seem like giving the outer edges a little attention might not be a bad idea. So I figured we'd just steer around what the normal routine here would be and give this a go. And part of the reason I guess I'm doing this is almost because of what we're reaching now at the very, very bottom, which is some pretty muddy looking stuff. I rewatched the video from last time to refresh my memory on how things in here went, and I did notice how wet it was in the video. And well, at the time too, obviously we knew it was very wet. That's the reason we piled in all kinds of dry bedding for them. I almost feel like we should do something similar today. It's pretty incredible. Here in bucket number 1 last time too, we were able to stack this stuff up so high, right up to the top here, and have almost a completely vertical wall here. And somehow in bucket number 2 we didn't have any luck doing that. It would always cave in, and for that reason I sort of assume that the material in bucket number 2 might not be quite as damp as what we're seeing here in bucket number 1. So a little aeration I guess doesn't hurt. And you know, while this thing is open like this, I don't think we're going to use my prepared bedding. I think we're going to come back in here just like we did last time with some dry, because I think I still have some dry shredded cardboard paper. No leaves in that, no moisture in that, but I think that's just what the doctor ordered here. 2 seconds, I'll be right back. I think last time we must have taken at least 2 or 3 handfuls about this size and mixed it in. And I will be curious to see, or I am curious, not that I will be. I'm not curious yet, but in a couple seconds, check back, I'm sure I will be. No, I'm definitely curious to see how things look down the middle, where we already did this same treatment of putting in the dry paper and cardboard in with the very damp materials. And I don't know, I think we did sort of get a little indication already just by seeing how much of that material had been, I don't know, you perceive it in your mind, I guess, as, ooh, they loved it, they must have eaten it, but it's in reality going in as something that's almost entirely air. And once the stuff settles, you're going to clearly see the level of it drop considerably. Same goes for those foods that the wormies had. Stuff that they probably ate pretty quickly because they really like pumpkin. and it probably even boosted the speed at which it was eaten because it was frozen. So I'm not sure if we'll see many leftovers of any pumpkin from the last feeding, but we might. I think it was 12 days now since we last checked in on these little guys. In another of my systems, it was about the same period between feedings, and there were signs of leftover pumpkin visible. Here too, I've gone pretty much down to the bottom, hitting very damp stuff, but as long as the stuff is all kind of tilled up and loose, I don't think the important thing here is to assemble a tall tower in a deep ditch. It's more of just getting far enough to provide the opportunity to sprinkle some of this stuff in. And this stuff I think is going to really also be beneficial to the system in general, as far as, you know, the worms needing bedding, or liking it a lot at least. So, I mean, once all the bedding is gone and now you're driving in a somewhat older system towards harvest, maybe you're not adding bedding or anything like that anymore, and yeah, in a system like that, it makes sense to not have bedding. But in general, the worms need a medium to live in, and if all they're living in is their, you know, their poop, basically, they'll be happy to live in it and they'll eat it and stuff, but it isn't that good for their health, I believe. So fresh bedding is pretty important in a worm bin. Alright. Doesn't feel to me like I've taken this much time checking in on these systems, at least not in a long time. So hopefully this is not getting drawn out too much, but I did sort of find what I expected. Maybe that's why I didn't go overboard chit-chatting about it, because I expected to find all kinds of bedding, blend it in over there. And it is kind of nice to see that it's not as gooey or sticky as what we found at the bottom. So I'm just coming in now with some of this stuff I bought here for them. Some of it just ended up on the ground. There we go. Trying to keep it all in the worm bin, not all over the ground. That looks to me like a pretty fair split of what we bought down here for these little guys. Perhaps just a little chunk of this, and that's got to be a good fair split. So you know what? Not going to worry so much about my worm chow today. Not even grit. I think we've given these guys plenty of grit over the past few feedings. Over here in bin number 1, this is bucket number 1. This is feeding number 16 going in, and when we feed bucket number 2, that'll only be feeding number 12 for them. Because you might remember we did a little set it and forget it test for 7 weeks. And we started that around age 50. We went till the systems were at age 100. So that was already five or six feedings ago, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. So I like how things look in here. Let's get back the feeding zone indicator. Pretty tattered, but what the heck, we're going to go for one more interval between feedings. Let this thing give us our money's worth. So let's move on and get bucket number 2 over here. Here, the system that was forgotten about for about 7 weeks was loaded up to the very rim with tons and tons of leaves, and then it was even worm chow sprinkled in between each layer of leaves. And the leaves were totally soaked. They went in here completely drenched. And then the only attention this system got was during each video we peeked in, maybe we removed the plastic just to make sure that things weren't going haywire. And then we went hands off and left it be. So I did make a few observations. I think one of them was I was surprised to see how much leafy matter remained still after that period of time. I suppose I expected them to have broken it down considerably. During that time too, bin number 1 was given pretty large portions of leaves each time as bedding. That was the only bedding used, just in the interest of perhaps at the end of the forget it period we might end up with 2 systems that were over time, one of them right away and the other one over time, given the same exact amount of bedding. Obviously the one thing they didn't receive without getting periodic feedings was the quantity of food that was placed regularly, based on just a general approach to feeding a worm bin. Whatever would be a normal amount was given every so often. Getting bin number 1 a few feedings ahead of bin number 2 here. material and stuff in this is so nice, gotta say. Not quite as damp and muddy as you saw, but still, I do like the idea of bringing in, oops, I almost grabbed my wet bedding. Let's grab my dry bedding and do the same here. We're going to layer in a little bit of dry, a little bit of food, and here we'll layer in the food down the middle. Here on the edges we're just going to sprinkle in a little bit of dry, hopefully absorbing bedding material, and if it worked the way I think it did in the other system, we'll probably see a little bit of drying. I mean, that's kind of what I thought I saw down the middle of the other system, where we went in with all the dry bedding material. Here I'm even seeing some leaves. I don't think we've used leaves in either of these systems for a while now. For a while it was the de facto bedding. Here I'm almost feeling like adding dry is not even necessary, because this stuff actually has such a nice flaky consistency to it. I can even see lots of leafy matter, mixed in with this stuff. Definitely not as muddy as we saw. So here perhaps we don't have to compensate for what would be considered excess moisture. Well, I guess on the other side maybe it made good sense to sprinkle in a little bit, but there too we didn't put in much. I'm just getting curious because now I want to go all the way to the bottom. This definitely looks to me a little bit muddy. Let's definitely add some to the material we're pulling out of the very bottom here too. Let's give this stuff the benefit of a little bit of blended in bedding too, and then we can feed here as well. So I'm not going to try to stack it up so I can get to some sort of hands-free state. I think I'm just going to try to do it quickly enough so that I can not have the whole thing collapse on me. Oops, excuse me. Alright, yeah. That's pretty good too, because all this damp, really damp stuff that was stacked up on the very top that needs drying is what we just ended up combining with that last handful of dry. So that's pretty cool. I like how this stuff in here looks. I like to be able to crumble and loosely plow through this stuff, Even little sections that almost appear dry. It doesn't seem to me like this is the type of feeding that's going to bring with it a huge amount of moisture. Maybe a little bit as the fruits thaw out. They're being delivered frozen, as you might have noticed earlier when we fed bucket number 1. But I think we've probably opened up a big enough hole here where we can pile in the feeding and then leave them be. Just to be fair, let's drop in a handful of stuff here. I can feel the stuff falling between my fingers each time I reach across the table to get more. So I've got a feeling my whole table behind us is, or at least behind the buckets from my point of view, is probably covered with shredded paper and cardboard. So I think we're pretty much done. Sorry, I was just grabbing this last little handful of stuff that was stuck to the transport container. So that's a couple pretty nice feedings. System here, bucket number 2, definitely seems a little bit drier. And I wouldn't mind if bucket number 1 was more like this, bucket number 2. But they're both really nice, I gotta say. They both have their pros and cons, I suppose. They were, prepared at the same time with the intent of trying to get them in sync with one another from the start, but keeping things in sync, especially when you do something major like deviate from the feeding schedule and forget about one of them for 7 weeks. Things are bound to, diverge a little bit and get a little bit of result like this here, a little bit of result like that there. So checking in on these is always fun. Alright everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.